If you've ever wanted to learn the secrets to influence, persuasion, and high-powered communication skills, then sit down and stay tuned, because in this video, I am going to share with you all of the knowledge that I have ever learned about human communication as it relates to influence and persuasion. Hey guys, my name is Paul Macetta, and I am a researcher and a publisher in the field of human communication. So if you like learning about human communication, influence, persuasion, and things like that, then go ahead and consider subscribing. So let's jump right in. So number one, the ability to influence, persuade, and communicate effectively is the most important skill set I believe you, me, and everybody else on this planet can develop. Now, it's been said that there are three things that make us superior to every other species on the planet. Number one is our opposable thumbs. Number two is our predator eyesight. And number three is our ability to communicate. So think about that. 33% or 1/3 of our superpowers are tied to our ability to communicate. So if you're not actively working on and refining and mastering your ability to communicate, it's almost like you're cutting yourself short as a human being. I mean, let's face it, you could have all the talent, the ability, the skill sets, the experience, the wisdom in the world, but if you can't effectively communicate that you have those things and effectively communicate them to other people, not only are you likely to fall short in life, but the worst part is that you're likely to fall short to someone else who might not be as knowledgeable, skilled, experienced, or educated as you, but they do have that ability to communicate. So this is far and away the most important skill set anyone can develop. Now, here's the good news. This is lesson number two. The ability to effectively communicate is a skill that can be learned. Now, are there people that are just born natural communicators? Absolutely. But the same is true of every other aspect in life. In every other aspect of life, there are people that are born with natural abilities that kind of cut the line and get ahead of everyone else. They start out with a nice head start, and then there are other people that have to work at those things. I learned this taking Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu classes. So I've been training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu now going on 12 years. And I have no athletic ability. I have absolutely no history of playing sports or anything like that. In fact, I don't even watch professional sports. I find them to be absolutely boring and a waste of time. But I do watch MMA, and I learned the hard way that there are certain guys that are just athletically gifted, or they pick up the moves and the concepts like intuitively, and they just get good really fast. And I learned that the only way I was ever going to get good was I needed to put in reps. I needed to just train. And eventually, I would get to a point where I could rely on my experience in order to be a good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner. Now, again, just like every other aspect in life, there are certain people that are born with certain attributes that give them a head start in certain things, and then there are other people that have to work at it, like I had to when it came to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So the same is true when it comes to your communication skills. So what I don't want you to do is don't look at somebody else that's a natural born communicator that maybe intuitively knows how to connect with people and read them and kind of has a magnetism about them, or maybe they have a natural charisma about them, and you're like, man, that's not me, so I could never be a great communicator. That's not true. This is a skill set that you can learn. In fact, it's what I've devoted the past 14 years of my life sharing with people, is all the stuff that I've learned. It's what this entire channel is about. It's what this video is about. These are all the concepts that I've learned over the past, call it 25 years of studying influence, persuasion, and human communication, and the past 14 years teaching it professionally to other people. Number three, is that some people cannot be persuaded. So a lesson that you have to learn very early on is when you are studying influence persuasion, trying to level up your communication skills, you might envision this version of yourself where you're a master communicator that can walk into a room and own it and magnetize people toward you. You have this unrivaled sense of confidence. You can overcome objections. You could start a conversation with anybody, and you can get even the most resistant person to say yes to you. And that is certainly a good vision to have and a good thing to be striving for. Like, striving for that version of yourself is one of the best things that you can do. That being said, you have to realize that we are living in the real world, and the real world consists of different people with different personalities, different value systems, different outlooks, different opinions on different things. And so the idea of being able to persuade or influence anybody at any given time is just simply not practical, and it's not realistic. And it's your job as a master communicator to identify when in the communication cycle this person cannot be persuaded. So I could be selling the best high quality organic grass-fed beef that money can buy, but if I am speaking to a vegetarian, they are not going to say yes to me. They have a different value system. They have a different belief system that no matter what I say to them will result in them saying no to me. And it's a waste of my time, and it's a waste of their time if I sit there trying to change their mind. This is especially true when it comes to religion and politics. They say never talk religion and never talk politics, and there's a reason why. It's because these subjects, people's opinions and outlooks on these subjects are tied to deeply held beliefs and opinions that are very hard to change. In fact, getting someone to change an opinion when it comes to religion or politics is like almost asking them to change their identity, because their beliefs, the stronger their beliefs are when it comes to subjects like that, the stronger those beliefs are tied to their identity. And getting people to change their identity is a very, very difficult, if not impossible, thing to do. People have to want to change their identity on their own. It has to be a decision that they make. And so getting people to do that, especially in the context of like a simple conversation, is very challenging. So you have to know that some people just cannot be persuaded. Number 4, some people are just not worth persuading. So sometimes you have to calculate the trade-off between the time, money, energy, resources that you're going to invest to try to get this person to agree with you or to say yes to you versus the likelihood of them actually doing it or what's going to happen after they do it. So you might, for instance, be selling a car, or let's call it a gym membership. Let's say you're selling a gym membership. And so once the person joins, they're going to become an active member of the club and start using the club 3, 4, 5 days a week. And in the midst of you making your sales presentation to them and maybe them giving you objections and them resisting, you start to realize that there are certain qualities about this person that wouldn't necessarily make them the best fit for the overall community. So maybe they're an egomaniac, maybe they're rude, maybe they're a little bit obnoxious, maybe they're selfish, maybe they are just displaying characteristics to you that kind of tell you that they would actually be, the gym would be a worse place having this person as a member than not having them as a member. And so, again, you need to make a decision in that moment, like, what's worth more to me? Winning this sale and overcoming all the objections and changing the person's mind and getting them to submit and getting them to say yes and chalking up another sale on the sales board and getting a commission, or avoiding a person that could possibly wind up causing other members to quit their membership because they take too long on the weights, they don't re-rack their weights, maybe they throw weights, maybe they're obnoxious, maybe they're rude, maybe they ask people to get off machines, and so they caused a negative impact on the overall dynamic of the place. So at the end of the day, they're just not worth persuading. Or maybe you're trying to persuade somebody to make a change in their life, and you get to a point where you realize that it's just not worth having this conversation with them anymore because it's draining more from you and it's negatively impacting your overall relationship with that person, that maybe you should just let them figure things out on their own. Maybe you know somebody that's in a toxic relationship and you keep trying to influence, persuade, and convince that person that they should leave the person that they're with, but they go back to that person, and then when you have that conversation with them again, it causes a rift between you two where they start telling you, don't get involved in my business, mind your business, stop trying to give me advice. And then they launch personal attacks on you saying, your relationship isn't perfect, you don't know everything, why are you telling me how I should be living my life? You have to realize that at some point, that person is just not worth persuading. You need to leave them alone and let them figure this out on their own. Number 5, which is the complete opposite of this one, is that some people need to be persuaded the hard way. So if we've ticked box number 3 and we say, can this person be persuaded? And the answer is yes. And then we move on to number 4 and we say, is it worth persuading this person? And the answer to that question is yes. So we know that they can be persuaded and we know that they are worth persuading, but it's becoming increasingly challenging to persuade them. Depending on the relationship and the level of rapport that you have with this person, you might just have to persuade them the hard way. And so what I mean by the hard way is sometimes you might need to give them a reality check. Sometimes you might need to present facts to them that they weren't aware of that could possibly scare them or shock them out of complacency. Sometimes you have to paint such a picture, a grim picture of what they stand to lose if they don't say yes to what you're presenting to them, that they have no other choice but to say yes. So sometimes, you really got to pull out the big guns and, for lack of a better term, you have to really tie pain to their decision or their lack of a decision to comply with you. So what I mean by that is, really, just to simplify things, the only 2 reasons people do anything in life is to experience pleasure or to avoid pain. Those are the 2 big categories that everything falls under. Now, yes, there are hundreds, if not thousands or millions of different subcategories that fall under those 2 things, but those are the 2 big ones. So really, to simplify everything, it's either to avoid pain or to gain pleasure. And in cases where people need to be persuaded the hard way, it's generally not about leading them toward pleasure. It's about taking them away from pain. And so you really need to clearly demonstrate the amount of pain that they stand to experience if they don't make the change that you are asking them to make. That is what persuading people the hard way is all about. Number 6, often what you think persuades people doesn't. So here's what I mean by that. Oftentimes people think that logic is what persuades people because they believe that all people are logical, analytical human beings that analyze and scrutinize every single decision in their life and then ultimately make a logical decision. This is true of me and it's true of you. If someone were to ask you, hey, do you think most of the time you make logical decisions? Most people are going to answer that question with a yes. They're going to say, well, sure I do. I analyze and I scrutinize and I weigh all the pros and the cons and I come to a logical decision. But the truth is, nothing could be further from the truth. The reality is that most of the time, we are either making decisions emotionally or we are using mental shortcuts called heuristics. So heuristics are basically mental shortcuts that are based on a filtration system. So the reality is, if we had to analyze and scrutinize every single piece of information that came into our world, we would have a mental breakdown, a mental meltdown. We would have a short circuit. So as a way of preserving our cognitive resources or saving our mental energy, that's a better way, an easier, simpler way of saying it. As a way of conserving our mental energy, we use shortcuts. So every single bit of data or information that comes into our brain, since as far back as we can remember, since children, what we do is we file that information away. And then when a new piece of information comes our way, we cross-reference it with all the other information that's been filed away, and then we make rapid decisions based on that filtration system. Because again, if we had to sit there and mentally analyze and scrutinize everything, it would just be too overwhelming for us. So as a means of efficiency, the brain uses this filtration system. Now, the reality is that we're using that filtration system the majority of the time. So the majority of decisions that we make are passed through that filtration system. It's only really big life-changing decisions, like maybe buying a house or something that has to do with a loved one, or something where we stand to either lose or gain a lot of resources, that the analytical mind comes into play. The reality is, most of the time we are using these mental shortcuts. So what does that mean for you as the communicator? It means that you need to know how these shortcuts work, and you need to know how to leverage them to your advantage. So in his book, Influence, Dr. Robert Cialdini explains and identifies these different weapons of influence. I've written about these extensively. I've done tons of videos on them. But for example, scarcity is one of them. And what the law of scarcity tells us is that we tend to desire something as it becomes less available. Now, your job as a communicator, as an influencer, as a persuader is not to challenge these things. These are forces at work. Your job is not to challenge them or try to change them. Quite honestly, it's a waste of time to do that. It's a better option to understand and know what they are and then just leverage these forces to your advantage. So, for example, if I'm flying a plane, my job as an aircraft engineer or a pilot is not to dispute or challenge the laws of gravity. It's not to challenge those things. It's to just understand how they work on a fundamental level and then leverage them so that I can take the plane up in the air and I can leverage things like lift and drag and whatever those things are that keep planes in the sky so that I can safely get people to where they need to go. So the same is true when it comes to the laws of influence, persuasion, and communication, right? So as human beings, we tend to desire things as they become less available. So if you're presenting something to someone, if you're selling something or you're making an offer to somebody, having some sort of legitimate scarcity built into the offer is always beneficial, because the scarcity could be the one thing that makes the person make the decision right then and right there. Another law of persuasion has to do with commitment and consistency. And what that tells us is that people generally like to stick to their commitments and they like to be consistent in their actions. Because when they break a commitment or when they are inconsistent in their actions, it causes something called cognitive dissonance in us, which is a feeling of unease that even if we try to lie about it or posture and pretend like it's really not affecting us, we might be able to do that on the outside, but on the inside, it's eating us up inside. And so when you communicate with people, when you make an offer to someone, when you present something to someone, you want to get them to commit and get them to be consistent in their commitments and in their actions, because the more likely, the more committed and the more consistent they are as it relates to what you're presenting to them, the more likely they are to say yes to you. So now this is not to say that people don't use logic. People use logic all the time, especially when there's a lot on the line. But you can't just rely solely on logic. You can't rely solely on logic, and that's what I mean when I say often what you think persuades people doesn't. The majority of the time, you need to leverage emotion and heuristics and then sprinkle in some logic to justify the decisions that were made using the shortcuts or heuristics or the emotions. Number 7 is that competence leads to confidence. So one of the challenges that most people have when it comes to influence, persuasion, and communication in general is a lack of confidence. In fact, most of the time, when people are not communicating effectively, it's a confidence issue. So think about this for a second. If I were to ask you to speak to me about something that you have absolutely no experience in, no interest in, for example, let's say tennis. If you've never played tennis before, and I start having a conversation with you about tennis, and I start asking you questions about tennis, you're not going to have the answers to those questions because you don't have an interest in it, you don't have a track record in it, you don't have any knowledge, you don't have any wisdom. So having that conversation is going to feel very awkward and strange to you. But now, imagine a situation where we are communicating about something that you are passionate about, something that you thoroughly enjoy, something that you do on a regular basis. It could be jujitsu, it could be guitar, it could be a sport. And so because you have that passion, as a byproduct of that, you're going to have knowledge, you're going to have wisdom. And so when you communicate, you're not going to lack confidence. You're going to have the confidence that you need because you have the competence in that area. See, most of the time when people lack confidence as it relates to communication, it's because they're imagining scenarios in their brain that are unfavorable. They're imagining that they're not going to have the answer to the question that someone asked them, that there's going to be awkward silent moments, that they're going to be found out that they are an imposter, that they're going to say things that don't make sense, that they're going to stumble over their words, that people aren't going to respect them. And ultimately, the cure for all of that is competence. Like, yeah, there are other things that will make you more confident, adjusting your body language, your tonality, your speech, your vocal rate, and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, competence is the most important thing. I'll take a person who's super competent in something, but lacks all of the confidence, the outside confidence stuff, like their posture and their vocal tone and their tonality and their volume and their speech rate, because I could change all that. Competence, that's tough because you actually have to earn that. But once you do, that's what leads to true confidence. The next lesson is that context, environment, and circumstance matter. So lots of times people will ask me, I learned this technique, I learned this tactic, should I use this, should I not use this? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on the context, environment, and circumstance. You don't use every single technique or tactic in every context, environment, and circumstance. And so the true trait of a master communicator is awareness. Awareness is the most powerful trait you can have as a communicator. It supersedes everything else because you could have all the words, you could have all the body language, you could have all the posturing, you could have all the right tone, you could be charismatic, you could be magnetic. But like if you do not have awareness, self-awareness, awareness of the people you're communicating with, and awareness of the context, environment, and circumstances, you could potentially use all of that stuff in the wrong way and have it backfire and blow up in your face. Like the fact is, you don't communicate the same way at a wedding as you do at a funeral, and you don't communicate the same way with your boss at a business meeting as you do at a bar with your buddies before a football game. And if you do, you probably have issues when it comes to communication. So awareness of the context, environment, and circumstances, and then having that ability to understand, is this the right time to say this, to do this, to deploy this thing? That's what's most important. Number 9 is that people allow themselves to be persuaded by people that they like and people that they feel they are like. So the reality is, true persuasion is not when you force someone to do what you want them to do. It's when you present your case in such a way that they persuade themselves to take the action that you wanted them to take. See, there's a difference between forcing people, cajoling people, coercing people into doing things, and just explaining things in such a way that they see the payoff and the benefit that's in it for them, so they make the decision to say yes, and that decision just happens to be what you're asking them to do. So anytime we attempt to influence or persuade someone, we're going to deal with resistance because we're asking them to change in some way. And because people are naturally resistant to change, they are naturally resistant to influence and persuasion. There are 3 major things that impact their level of resistance. Number 1 is the level of risk that is involved for them. Number 2 is the payoff that's involved for them. So there's always a relationship between the risk and the payoff. And then the third thing is how they feel about us. That's the third thing that influences the level of resistance that people will have when we communicate with them. The more they like us and the more they feel they are like us, the less resistant they are going to be. Now, we might not have control over the first 2 things. We might not have control over the level of risk, and we might not have control of the level of the payoff that's involved for them. But the one thing that we do have control over, for the most part, is how they feel about us. Next lesson. People will do more to avoid pain than they will to gain pleasure. So like I said, the only 2 reasons people do anything is to avoid pain or to gain pleasure. But statistically speaking, they will actually do more to avoid pain than they will to gain pleasure. So imagine for a second, you're sleeping, it's the middle of the night, all of a sudden your doorbell rings, you wake up half asleep, you check the door and it's your neighbor. And he's like, "Hey John, I just want to let you know, Sears is running a 50% off sale on tires right now. So you can go buy 4 tires and pay half of what you normally would pay." And you're like, okay, thanks for letting me know. So you close the door, you go back to sleep thinking your neighbor's out of his mind. You go back to sleep, and that's the end of it. Now imagine a second scenario where you're sleeping, the doorbell rings, you answer the door, it's the neighbor, and he's like, "Hey John, I got bad news, man. I just came home from work. Your car is up on a lift and all your tires got stolen." "Yeah, man, I know it's terrible. Call the cops, do what you need to do, call your insurance company. By the way, Sears is running a 50% off sale right now, so if you got to get new tires, you might as well get them from Sears because you're only going to pay half of what you normally would pay." Think about the difference between those 2 scenarios and your desire to buy those tires now. You're having the same conversation. The only thing that changed is in one scenario, you're gaining something that you might not need, and in the second scenario, you're replacing something that you lost. And if you don't got those tires, you can't drive. If you can't drive, you can't go to work, you can't go to your business, you can't take people to the store, you can't go to the doctor, you can't go to the grocery store. So there's lots of pain involved in there. The sooner you get those tires, the sooner the pain goes away. People will do more to avoid pain than they will to gain pleasure. Next lesson. People care more about themselves most of the time. This is not to say that most people are selfish and that they're mean and that they don't care about anybody else. But what it says is that we are a self-preserving species, and our main goal and our function in life is to survive and then thrive. Number one goal is to survive. So oftentimes what I see is when people communicate and their goal is to influence or persuade someone, they spend too much time talking about themselves, talking about how great they are, the accomplishments that they've had in their life, their track record, their testimonials, achievements that they've made, in order to get the other person to trust them. You know, when I help business owners improve their marketing, one of the first things I notice is when I go to their website, the website is all about the business owner. It's 25 different pictures of the business owner, stories about the business owner, testimonials about the business owner, blog posts about the business owner, pages and pages of all the great things that the business owner has done. And like the reality is, the customer doesn't care that much about you. The only reason they care about you is because they care about your ability to help them solve the problem. So all you need about you is just enough information to let them know that you are qualified to solve that problem, and that's it. Everything else should be about the customer. The customer's pain, the customer's challenges, the customer's goals, the customer's desires, and then how you can help them achieve those things. People care more about themselves most of the time, especially in the context of influence and persuasion. And if you're attempting to influence and persuade someone, and your main method of doing that is by talking about how great you are so that they trust you, you are making a fatal mistake. Yes, you need to talk about yourself and your quality and your expertise and your credibility. That definitely matters, but it matters like this much. It matters like 15% out of 100. 85% should be about the customer, the client, the person you're communicating with. 15% should be about you. Next lesson. People are emotional first and logical second. So, as I said before, the only two reasons people do anything is to avoid pain or to gain pleasure. Why? Because of how those things will make them feel. They either want to avoid the feeling that the pain is going to bring them, or they want to experience the feeling that the pleasure is going to give them. Both of those things are tied to emotion. And so if you are not aware of the emotion that you're trying to tap into when you communicate with somebody, you're going to have a hard time communicating with them. Now, I've posted stuff like this before, and I've had some of my super analytical friends, especially people in finance, they'll dispute this. They'll say nothing could be further from the truth. I'm in finance. All we care about is numbers, charts, data, statistics, analytics, etc. So what I say to them is, okay, well, imagine that you were analyzing a company to invest in, and you were asking the business owner for their slide deck and their data and their analytics and all their numbers so you could logically evaluate whether or not this is a good investment. Well, after you've evaluated everything and made your decision, what is that decision ultimately backed by? It's backed by either the desire to avoid the pain of making a bad investment or the pleasure that comes with making a good investment. You're only making that investment because of the way it's going to make you feel. That's what I mean when I say people are emotional first and logical second. All of our decisions are driven by an emotion. We make decisions because of what we think those decisions will make us feel. That's why we're emotional first and logical second. Next lesson. People respond more to the way a message is presented than to the message itself. There's a famous research study where they asked people about a car accident, and based on the way they asked the question, they got varying answers from the people. When they asked how fast was the car going when they crashed into each other, people might have said 50 miles an hour. When they asked people how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, they would say 70 miles an hour. When they asked people how fast were the cars going when they collided into one another, they would give a different answer. And so what this tells us is that you can drastically impact the way something is perceived by the way it's presented and by the way it's framed. So lots of times people get caught up in the message. What am I supposed to say? What are the words that I'm supposed to use? And look, that matters. The words absolutely matter. Words paint a picture. But people respond more to the way the message is presented than to the message itself. Here's an example. Let's take the phrase, I didn't say he hit his wife. 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 I'm saying the same thing, but every time I say it, I'm changing the pronunciation of the way I'm saying it, and it's having a different impact. It's the same words, but the message itself sounds different, and it's being perceived differently. I can change the way somebody responds to that message by changing the way I present the message. This is important. You need to understand this in both one-on-one communication and in online communication. Lesson number 14. You are being judged. This one sometimes is hard for people to hear and understand, and the same is true for me. This applies to everybody. We are all being judged. In fact, when they say don't judge a book by its cover, it's some of the stupidest advice I've ever heard in my life, because we're all being judged by our covers. And there's a reason why big publishing companies spend a lot of time figuring out the ideal cover for a book. It's because they know that covers matter, because we all judge books by their covers. Listen, we have no other choice but to judge. When we communicate with somebody, it usually happens in the first 5 to 7 seconds. We make a subconscious judgment about that person. Now, I think better advice is when we say, don't take that initial judgment and then cast that onto the person and make that be your final judgment. So in other words, if I meet somebody for the first time and I have a judgment about them that's unfavorable, I shouldn't let that dictate how I feel about them. Look, I'll be honest with you. There have been plenty of people that I've met that when I initially met them, they rubbed me the wrong way and I just didn't like them. There was something about them I didn't like. And then I wound up becoming great friends with them. That's what people mean when they say don't judge a book by its cover. But saying that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover initially, or that that doesn't happen, or that it's wrong for that to happen, is faulty advice, because as human beings, as a self-preserving survival species, we always judge people by their covers. We always judge people immediately because we want to immediately ascertain if they are a threat to our resources. So you just have to know this and understand this. Like, don't walk into a business meeting dressed the way you want to dress because you're like, people aren't going to judge me. They're going to judge me by their track record. Absolutely not. They are going to judge you by the way you look, by the way you speak, by the way you carry yourself, by the way you dress. All of that matters. And the sooner you understand that, the better. Lesson number 15. People can see the same thing differently. So there's a very famous presupposition in the world of NLP, or neuro-linguistic programming, that says the map is not the territory. What that means is the territory is objective reality. It's the world that we live in. The map is the mental map that we use to make sense of the world. Well, all of us have different maps that we use to make sense of the territory, and the map is different than the territory. So just the way you look at a map on your GPS to find a physical location, but when you get to that physical location, it looks different than it does on the map. The same is true of the way people make sense of the world. And because we're all using different maps, we can see objective reality in a way that is very subjective. They say that if you hold an apple up in front of 20 people, every person perceives that apple slightly differently. even though it's an apple. It's objective. We know what it looks like. We know what it tastes like. We know what it feels like. We know what it smells like. Yet every person experiences it slightly differently. You need to understand that not everyone is going to see the world the same way you do. They're not going to have the same perspectives, the same outlooks, the same beliefs, the same thoughts, the same opinions. They're not even going to experience reality the same way. You could witness something that somebody sees in a completely different way than you did. It's important to understand this so that when you communicate with people, you want to try to understand what their map is of the territory so that you can communicate with them in such a way that it resonates with them and it makes sense. One of the things I always tell people when it comes to communication is, do you want to be persuasive or do you want to be right? Because those are two different things. Lots of times people get caught up in being right. I'm going to prove my point. I'm going to get them to see things my way. They're going to understand it's my way or the highway. They're going to understand that what I'm saying is absolute truth and it can't be disputed and it can't be denied. Okay, great. You proved your point. Now what? Ultimately, did you get the person to do what you wanted them to do that would mutually benefit the both of you? If you didn't, who cares? Who cares? Okay, so you proved your point, you satisfied your ego, you walked away thinking, ha ha ha, I'm right, I proved that person wrong. Congratulations. What came out of it? Did anything positive come out of it? Did a win-win situation come out of it? Did you grow? Did they grow? Is there some financial payoff? Is there a business deal? Is there an emotional payoff? Maybe you could have gotten them to see that in a way where you aligned with their beliefs and now they don't resent you for acting obnoxious. People see the same things wildly differently. It's your job and your responsibility as a communicator to understand this and leverage it to your advantage by being open and listening to what other people say when they speak to you so that you could understand their map of the territory and communicate with them in a way that resonates with them. Number 16, people are more likely to comply with a request that is justified. So again, going back to Cialdini's book, Influence, there's this famous research study that he talks about in that book where the researchers wanted to test how people would respond to a request based on how the request was made. So they put a woman in a line full of people that were waiting to make photocopies, and they wanted to see if people would allow her to cut them in the line based on how she asked to cut them or how she made the request. So when she asked people, can I cut ahead of you in line? Maybe 20% of people said, okay, go ahead. When she said, can I cut ahead of you in line because I'm in a rush, 40% of the people let her go ahead. And when she said, can I cut ahead of you because I'm in a rush, because I have to make some copies, like 90% of the people let her cut ahead of her in line. And if you think about it, what did she really do there? What she did was she increased the justification every time. So the first time she gave no justification, she just asked to cut ahead of them in the line. The second time she asked to cut ahead of them because she was in a rush. So that's one level of justification. More people let her go. Then she said, can I cut the line because I'm in a rush, because I have to make some copies. So she added another level of justification. But everybody on that line was in line to make copies. The point is, nobody even analyzed the fact of that she was saying that she has to achieve the same task that everybody else does. They just heard the justification. So people are more likely to respond and say yes to a request when it is justified. This also works exceptionally well in marketing. If you are running a sale of some sort, anytime you can logically justify why you're running the sale. It legitimizes the sale and makes it that much more powerful. This is why holiday sales work so well. It's why Black Friday sales work so well. I know marketers that at one point were using like a tax payoff sale, meaning they were running, they got hit with a big tax bill and they needed to pay it. And so that's the reason why they were running such a big sale. It legitimizes the reason why the person is getting the sale and the savings, and it makes it feel like it's that much more urgent and that they should jump on it. Lesson number 17. The majority of your communication takes place non-verbally. Now, look, over the years, there's been lots of different debates and disputes about, is it 55%, is it 80%? At this point, I wouldn't want to give you an exact number, but what I would say is that the majority of your communication in general takes place non-verbally. So your non-verbal language or your body language is responsible for how the majority of your message is communicated. This is important because you could be saying all the right things with your mouth, using all the right words, the right tonality, the right vocal speech, the right tone, the right volume, saying the actual right words, but you could be counteracting that with the wrong body language. You see, deep within all of us is the ability to subconsciously read body language. Again, this dates back to primitive times where we as a species needed to identify threats to our resources without verbal language. So there was a point in time where we did not communicate verbally and we needed to be able to read people non-verbally. This is still embedded in us. So when we communicate with people, what we're looking for is an alignment between their body language and their spoken language. And if we find a misalignment between the two, it causes us to not trust the person we're communicating with, to feel like something's off about them, and to question their motives or their intentions. Conversely, when there's a big alignment between our body language and our vocal language, we can actually make the vocal language better, more effective, and more powerful. So when you supplement your vocal language with body language, your vocal language and your messaging becomes that much more powerful. So you need to pay attention to your vocal and your nonverbal language. You want to be able to tell a story and paint a powerful picture when you communicate with people by tying your gestures and your nonverbal language to your verbal language. Lesson number 18, people follow the group. It's very simple. If you've seen these videos on TikTok where, you know, somebody's walking down the street and they all of a sudden they start looking up and like everybody else starts looking up, it's because, again, we are trained as a species to follow the group. So most of the time we look to see what the majority of other people are doing in a certain situation, because that tells us that that's probably the right thing to do, even if it's not. Right? Remember, when we talk about influence, persuasion, and these laws that govern how people think and behave, our job is not to criticize them or try to change them. That's a waste of time. Your job is to leverage them and harness them to your ability. So yeah, is it stupid sometimes and foolish that a bunch of people do something that makes absolutely no sense and then other people follow their lead and do that because they're doing it? Is it senseless sometimes? Absolutely. But what does it prove? It proves that it's real and it exists. And this is the reason why social proof is so powerful. When you have case studies, whether written or videos, of people all saying a similar thing about something, it influences the minds of the other people to believe that if this thing happened for them, or if this thing was good for them, or if this was the right decision for all these people, it's probably the right decision for me. This is the reason why book publishers will put over 1 million copies sold on the cover of the book, because what it tells the new reader is, if 1 million people bought this book, it must be good. So I should probably buy this book. That's how social proof works. Lesson number 19, talked about this earlier, but I'm going to drive it home again. People make rapid subconscious decisions. So most of the time, we are using mental shortcuts called heuristics to make sense of the world and to make decisions. As a master communicator, as someone that wants to get good at influence and persuasion, you need to understand what these heuristics are, how people use them, and then how to leverage them to your advantage. So I would say a good starting point is the book Influence by Dr. Robert Cialdini, written over 40 years ago. Go read that book. It'll tell you the 6 weapons of influence that he's identified, how the majority of people respond and how they process information, and how you could leverage these things to your advantage. You could also read the book Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. Very, very powerful book that really focuses on behavioral economics. That book was written by Daniel Kahneman, and it's deep, but very, very eye-opening in terms of the way people process information and the way they can be influenced to think and behave in a certain way. And really, this whole book is built on the fact of what I'm talking about here, is that people use rapid, subconscious shortcuts to make sense of the world. And then the last and final message or lesson that I'm going to share with you in today's video is another NLP presupposition, which I think is very powerful. The meaning of all communication is the response that it elicits. The meaning of all communication is the response that it elicits. So what that means is, when you communicate with other people, regardless of what your intentions may be, the meaning of that communication is always dictated by how they respond to it. And if their response is not the response that you wanted, it means you communicated ineffectively. Now, look, you might say to yourself, listen, it's not my fault. I communicated the right way. I laid everything out. I said everything that needed to be said, and like that person is just not getting it. Okay, I get that. I've been there. Then we would go back to lesson number 3, which is some people cannot be persuaded, and lesson number 4 was that some people are not worth persuading. But assuming they are, assuming they can be persuaded, and assuming that they are worth persuading, and assuming that your goal is to be a master communicator, you have to take 100% responsibility for how that interaction goes. Because the minute you don't, you relinquish your power and you say, I don't have the power to be an effective communicator, because no matter what I say, people interpret it the wrong way. Think about it. Is that how master communicators talk? Is that what they say? Do they say, hey, I'm a master communicator, but when I talk, people don't pay attention, they don't listen, they interpret it the wrong way? They say, no, I have the ability to influence the outcome of this communication cycle and this interaction. And the first step in doing that is by understanding that the meaning of this communication that's taking place is the response that it elicits. How the person responds is going to dictate what the meaning of this communication was, regardless of what my intentions might have been. And so if the response is not the one I wanted, I need to go back to the drawing board. I need to change the things I'm saying. I need to rethink my approach. That is one of the most effective things you could do as a master communicator. Guys, if you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and that bell notification so you get updated when I release more videos like this. I would love to know in the comments your thoughts. Have you used any of this stuff? Do you agree, disagree? Would love to hear what you guys think about this type of content. I'll see you in the next video.